Welcome to the Blue Yonder Overland podcast. I'm your main host, Jen, and I'm so excited to welcome you back to this show that is all about inspiring and empowering you to get more outdoor adventure into your life, however that looks, but especially to make overlanding more approachable. Each week, we bring you tips and tricks for vehicle-based adventuring, interviews with folks that are doing it, and just breaking down any mental barriers you may have to really embracing an adventurous life. If you have any comments or questions to follow up about this episode, feel free to send me a direct message at Blue Yonder Jen on Instagram or Threads, and we'll be posting all of the show notes and links on blueyonder-adventures.com. And there's also a contact form there if you're not on social media and want to send a comment that way. Welcome back to the Blue Yonder Overland podcast. This is our last episode of the first season before I take a little bit of a summer break. And I'd be really curious to hear from you if you would like to see a second season of the podcast, what you'd like to see covered, or if you think I should change my focus at all. One thing that I've been thinking about is that in all of the interviews that I've done, I tend to gravitate towards unpacking what led these amazing folks and adventurers that I've gotten a chance to meet this season, what led them down their adventurous path, and what sort of decision points did they have to wrestle with? What influences were a part of their life at that time where they made a decision to dive into one adventure or another? Those are the types of questions that I've been having a really fun time unpacking and hearing about, because I find it so inspiring, and hopefully you do too. But realizing that that's the area that I have been most interested in makes me also realize that that's not limited to overlanding specifically. And while I've had a really fun time diving into a lot of the overlanding tips and tricks and helping people learn how to get out of campgrounds, how to find dispersed sites, how to embrace the magic of camping without being tied to a very competitive and online reservation system for so many campgrounds in the US, I'm realizing that the things I want to talk about might be slightly broader than that. So I'd be curious to get your take on what you think I should do with the focus and scope of the podcast in season 2. If I should broaden it to just be talking about adventures generally, keep a focus on overlanding, or bring in other topics such as other outdoor adventures and sort of focus on any outdoor adventures. So let me know in comments, or you could send me direct messages on Threads or Instagram, or even send me a comment through the website. If you do have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. So this week, we've actually just returned from Overland Expo Pacific Northwest, which is where I'm finding a lot of my adventurous inspiration for the week, for sure. If you haven't been to an expo like this one, it's a bit of a circus. And obviously, I think you can have so many different experiences there, but a lot of it depends on you shaping the experience you want for yourself. And at a minimum, I think coming out of these expos, what you do get is such an amazing exposure to so many different types of camping setups and rigs and tools and awesome new gear. And it's really, really interesting for me as I walked around and looked at different people's setups, even in the campground, just to see the variety of ways that people are solving basic problems that everyone faces camping. Some of them more critical problems than others, let's be real. Some of the gear is definitely, as in our case, we prioritize comfort or convenience, maybe to the extreme. But that's also fun to see what people cook up for their rigs or for their lounge chairs. We saw some really cool hammock setups. I'm going to need to go grab the name of that vendor that we saw, that allows you to basically set up a little freestanding hammock stand that's attached on a hinge to some part of your vehicle, whether it's on top or the side, wherever, so that you're not dependent on trees to hang up your hammock. That was pretty cool. But like I was saying, it just provides a fascinating spectrum of solutions and ideas to solve these problems, which can give you a really good starting point, even if you're not going to buy any of these things on site. It just provides you, I think, with a good sense of perspective in the fact that there are so many different ways of approaching these problems, so many different ways of solving them. And it's really cool to get to hear directly from people that are using them what the pros and cons are, because as we've said before on this podcast, there's pros and cons with pretty much every camping solution, depending on what you want to prioritize. So that's where I've been finding adventurous inspiration for the past week or so. I do want to take a little bit of time in today's episode to just cover a few other takeaways from the Overland Expo Pacific Northwest, which just happened in Redmond, Oregon this past weekend. So I'll spend a little bit of time sharing some takeaways or lessons learned there. And then lastly, I just want to recap with sort of I would say, top 5 things to keep in mind when getting started overlanding. And this is drawn from sort of lessons learned across this entire season, a few practical things, but also just reminders that I was reminded of while down at the Overland Expo. So it all kind of ties together. A little bit of recap and a little bit of reminders for what it takes to get outside in adventures of all kinds, but especially overlanding. So for my Overlanding Expo takeaways, I would say there's 2 overarching things, and then I've got a couple of examples and favorite tips to share from some of the classes that I took as well. For starters, though, I realized that some of the most valuable connections that I made at the Overland Expo were seemingly random. So I found it was just a great reminder to myself to be open for deeper connections, no matter what the context was. And no matter if I had chosen to be part of something specifically like the Women Who Wander networking morning event, or whether it was just striking up a conversation with the person who happened to be camped next to the booth that my husband Matt was working at all weekend. And in both cases, I found some great connections, but it was just a good reminder that the universe is unpredictable and you cannot predict where you're going to come across your next great friend or next great advice or find inspiration. And so, like I said, I found some great conversations and interactions at a couple of the Women Who Wander specific events. They did a couple of kickoff things in the morning sessions. That was great just to kind of get a sense and feel for who else was there and their stories and why they were there and wanted to connect, and then to kind of keep an eye out for each other throughout the rest of the weekend. But probably my favorite event for the Women Who Wander sphere was the happy hour that they did on Friday night with a giant charcuterie board spread. You know how me and Matt love our charcut. And it was open for partners or allies of women as well, just anyone who is really wanting to encourage women to get out and wander as well. And so I dragged Matt along to it. He was a little bit skeptical that he should be there, but it ended up being then a great conversation starter when I saw another couple at the next table who were there by themselves, and we were able to introduce each other and meet them. And it turned out they were there because the wife is more into overlanding and had won a pass to the weekend through Subaru promotion that they did, and was trying to convince her husband of the idea of overlanding. So it was actually super helpful then for him to be able to talk to Matt and kind of hear what Matt loves about overlanding and hear the both of us and how it's been so exciting to get into overlanding and exploring more together. But we were also just able to find so many other sort of weird points of connection, like the fact that they'd gone to Marquette University, same as our close friends that we like to overland with, Brad and Lauren. And then hearing about some of the places that they lived and what they do for work. It turns out they'd moved out to Washington about a year ago so the woman could take a job with this life flight company. It's a helicopter ambulance as a nurse, which is the exact same company my friend Chris Petrick worked for, who I mentioned a couple episodes ago. We sadly lost way too soon. He died way too young. But it was weird to encounter this woman working alongside his former colleagues. So really a bit of a full circle moment from the universe. and then had some great conversations as I circled back later in the evening for sort of an after hours happy hour back at the Women Who Wander event, and connected with a few women who now have started an email thread and are talking about setting up a Zoom to kind of keep in touch and hear about adventures later. So I'm really eager to see what comes of that as well. And hopefully I'll even get to interview some of those women for a future podcast episode. They're up to some really cool stuff. But like I said, whether it was choosing to put myself in spaces where I was hopeful that I would form some good connections, like the Women Who Wander events, but also just being open to the more random connections. We ended up, the booth that Matt was working at all weekend was next to a space that some of the folks who were there camping and had signed up for some of the technical driving and training courses were able to camp at. And so I introduced myself to the guy who was right next to the spot the first night when we were setting up, because I also suspected we might be doing a late setup, and I wanted him to be sure to come over and say hi if we were being too loud later on. But anyway, it turns out the guy lives about half hour down the road from us in Chimicum, Washington, just down the road from Kingston. And he'd just been getting into overlanding this year. And so over the course of the weekend, we had several chances to chat. I was able to find him at one of the happy hours later in the weekend and just had a lovely conversation, and found he works at Amazon. I just quit a job at Amazon, so we found that to bond over. But also talked about meeting up with him and his wife once we're all back home here in the Kingston area, and seeing if we can help him and his wife get more into overlanding and sharing some spots and stuff like that. So that ended up being one of the just nicest unexpected connections that we made. And it was just because we happened to be camped next to each other. So that was really, really cool. A reminder that inspiration and connection can strike no matter where you are in the world, and even if you're not even particularly looking for it, but being open to it is just so helpful. And then the other big takeaway for me for the weekend was how incredibly helpful it is in terms of a learning experience to be able to sit down and talk with experts who are doing hands-on demos and are not afraid to make mistakes in front of their audience and then teach through that. So I do want to share a couple of tips and tricks I learned at some of the classes that I took. But I think my favorite class that I attended would have been this class that was all focused on trail tire repair. And it was taught by David Souza. And he's quite the veteran amongst overlanding circles, and he just had a wealth of knowledge to share. It was a packed session. I was able to find a seat right next to a girl who was there from Seattle, who sounded super technically knowledgeable already. She was asking some amazing questions that I didn't even think to ask. So that was really, really cool. And David walked through how to use tire plugs, how to insert them, how to make the process easier, especially if you're someone like me who doesn't have a lot of upper body or arm strength, and then also walk through sidewall repair. And he asked for volunteers to help do that. And they had an actual tire up front that they cut holes into or cut gashes into and then walk through the process of repair. And it made me realize just that hands-on learning and watching things go wrong in real time. And then David walking through, no problem. This happened. Here's what's happening. Here's how we can fix it. Or here's the next thing that we can try. And watching somebody who's a veteran also make mistakes and realize that is actually part of the solution, is just having that attitude of problem solving and creativity. And if one thing works, okay, take a deep breath. Let's assess the situation and what else could we try? What other tools do we have available to us? And what's the goal of what we're trying to do here? And so we watched him walk through with a volunteer, sort of assessing a puncture in a tire and using an impact driver with a little bit attachment to sort of get the hole actually a little bit bigger and cleaner, which actually makes it easier to insert the tire plugs. So that was a really good lesson learned in terms of practical takeaways for me, that I need to get more comfortable using drill and impact drivers, but also double checking what is in our tire repair kits that we keep in all vehicles. Because as David walked through all of this, and he stressed this as well, he said there's just a few of these things that I would never travel off-road in any vehicle without. And he just made a really good point that it's really easy to invest in these types of things, make sure you know how to use them, and then have them there. And it's one of the single biggest things you can do to make sure you don't get stuck somewhere in a really bad situation is being able to repair your tires and get out. And the other thing David stressed, which was something that Matt had mentioned too when we first talked about tire repair, is the goal of repairing a tire on trail is really to get you back to civilization, to get you back to where you can get it replaced or repaired or find services. Usually these tire repairs, especially if it's sidewall, they're not meant to be driven at highway speeds. But if it stops you from having to use your spare tire, then that is a win, because then you still have your spare tire to be able to use as a backup, or when you do get back to highway areas, if you need to put that highway safe spare on to then drive to your home destination or drive to services, you can, but hopefully you've still got a fully functional spare tire. And so the point of on trail or if you're off on these off highway networks of forest trails or Jeep trails, the point is really just to try to get your vehicle out to civilization with still a usable, fully functional spare in your back pocket. And so that was really cool to hear. He also brought on the team, the inventor and team behind GlueTread, which has a patent. It's actually the only sidewall repair product on the market. And I think we had talked about this in an earlier episode, but I didn't quite understand the level of research and testing that had gone into this. And it was really funny to hear about all of this from the perspective of the instructor, David, who's been in the industry for decades. And he was telling us these horror stories of having to sew tires back together and then being told about this GlueTread product a few years ago. And he's said, honestly, this sounds sketchy as hell. Like, there's no way this will work. So he got in touch with the company and they were super receptive to testing and learning from him. So he had actually gone out with the team that created GlueTread, and they had gashed up their tires, used the sidewall repair product, and put it through its paces at all sorts of horrible conditions, like traveling highway speeds off roads. And of course, they could do this because they took special precautions, having lead cars and sort of blocked off areas to be able to really put the product through its paces. And so he did all of this. He worked with the team without compensation. He's like, I know this sounds like a paid product placement, but it's not. He's never accepted payment from them, but was just really curious about their product and found them super receptive to taking his feedback, making the necessary tweaks to their product or tweaks to their instructions for using it, and then helping them in terms of refining what they've offered to the market. And it was also a good lesson that no matter how good the product is, any product, if you don't know how to use it correctly, then it's going to be worthless to you. And so that was what I paid the most attention to, was just specifically how to install and use tire plugs and the sidewall repair kit. But I learned a lot about materials engineering, oddly enough. Shout out back to my all my college buddies, most of whom were engineers, and materials engineering was always one of the things I thought was most interesting. But just learning how specifically, like, the glue that is sold with the GlueTread product is specifically formulated for non-treated, essentially pure tire rubber. And so learning that you had to sort of file down or sand down if there was any sort of raised lettering or raised tread on the tires to get it down to as smooth and flat a rubber as you possibly could to maximize the seal and adhesion of the glue and the patch. But also learning that if you sand it a little too hard, perhaps you're using an electric sander, and burned a little of the rubber, that would not work either. That you then had to carefully sand, probably by hand, away the burned rubber. Otherwise, the glue would not work as intended. And they said the biggest issues that they have with people if the product doesn't work is usually related to either them not getting the tire area that they need to seal cleaned down to just pure rubber, or it's using adhesive in a way that is not intended. So they actually have a little instructional card in the glue tread kit with the patch that says stop. And then before you apply the glue to this product, please read about how the pattern you're supposed to use. It's essentially using way less of it than most people think. And in a certain matrix dot pattern to get the best seal. So it was really great to sort of have that walkthrough and see these folks deal with problems that came up in real time and learn how to pivot and adapt. And gave me a lot more confidence that if I ever have to do an on-trail tire repair, I'll actually be able to use these amazing products that we have in our arsenal. So a couple other takeaways and favorite tips from some of the classes that I took. I went to a Q&A roundtable that was all about traveling in Canada and Alaska, which gave me a healthy dose of fear for ever traveling some of the iconic highways up in Alaska. They were talking about how rough the shale highways can be up there and how they'll basically eat up your tires. And so to travel with plenty of spares, I think the motorcyclist that was on the panel talked about having essentially 2 front tire spares and 1 rear tire spare, which I thought was amazing and excessive. She only got away with it because she also had a sidecar as part of her setup, which was pretty cool. The other thing, of course, they stressed, as you might expect, was topping up with fuel and water literally everywhere you can get it, whether you have 3/4 of a tank left or not. And then it was also just interesting, I think, to hear about the Crown land system, which is similar to our federal land here in the US, but essentially you don't really need a permit or anything. Once you've identified Crown land, if the gates are open, you can camp there. But it was interesting to learn a little bit about Vancouver Island, which is pretty near to us, would be our closest sort of entry point into Canada. And hearing that that's actually one of the easiest and sort of stress-free border crossings that most of the panel was familiar with was this ferry that you can get from Port Angeles, Washington up to Victoria, which then puts you on Vancouver Island. And so hearing about that, how easy it is, was really inspiring. And hopefully we'll get to take a trip up there soon to do a little overlanding on Vancouver Island, but also getting a sense of sort of the lay of the land in terms of there's not much Crown land available for dispersed camping on the southern end of Vancouver Island, but the further north you go, sort of the more camping opportunities there are. And they were also sharing some about sort of when the busy seasons tend to be in Canada, essentially from May 20th through early October when the Canadian Thanksgiving is. Oftentimes you might find campgrounds entirely closed outside of those windows. So that's also something to be aware of, is even though the weather might seem nice, it's already they might already be prepping for the winter season after early October or before May 20th. It may not have opened up yet. So those are some great tips to keep in mind. I also really enjoyed the class I went to on improvised first aid, which was hilarious because the instructor ended up sharing a lot of stuff that he kept apologizing for grossing people out, but also we had all chosen to attend this class called improvised first aid. So you had to expect that it was going to get a little grisly at times. My takeaway from this class is that I really need to sign up for a wilderness first aid class because the instructor could not stress enough how badly you could mess things up for folks if you are attempting to do things you are not trained to do. But it was also really interesting to talk through just some of the common injuries that you might encounter and sort of what the goal of treatment was, and thinking through, well, if this is the goal and you do not have a way to mitigate this problem, are there things that you might have on hand, materials you might have on hand, where you could sort of imitate the effect of medical gear or medical procedure? And so he was talking through especially improvised splints for different strains or breaks, but also talking through sort of the decision points of, he's like, well, if this is happening, then you need to accelerate your path to emergency care, whether that's abandoning everything and pooling resources and people to carry this person out, or sending that SMS emergency text for some sort of emergency vehicle rescue. It was really helpful to have some sense in your head of like, okay, well, if these trigger points happen, then you need to be accelerating whatever it is you're doing because you don't have as much time as you think. And that's where I think it really stressed to me the importance of getting a little bit more training so that you're just a little bit more aware of what those problem points are and when you need to not take somebody's word that they're okay. Because I think for Matt and for a lot of the people that I am most closely adventuring with, I think my sister is the same way. They'll pretend they're fine. They'll say they're fine. They can handle it. Sure, it's a little bit of pain. Maybe they're bleeding. Maybe they have a blister, but it's fine. They don't need any sort of pain meds. They'll be absolutely fine. No need to worry about them. And it was just a good reminder of needing to educate ourselves on sort of the thresholds for when these issues are actually problematic and could lead to much bigger problems. Those are some of my favorite takeaways from Overland Expo Pacific Northwest. And it really motivated me as well to just keep an eye out for future classes. I had such a fun time at the classes that I went to, and I took copious notes because I'm a nerd, but really fun to revisit those and put them to use in our future trips. I think that from there, I'd love to just transition to, as we think about this whole season of episodes on overlanding and how to get into it and sort of covering a lot of the basic questions about overlanding and camping, I'd love to circle back to what I am seeing as the top 5 takeaways or tips to get started in overlanding. And so the first is just a reminder to get started in whatever way you can. It doesn't require fancy gear, fancy vehicles. It doesn't require even much knowledge. It just requires simply getting out there, even if it's just as simple as one overnight. You can always mitigate things. You can always choose something that's within cell service if you don't have specialized communications, Garmin InReach, things like that. You could choose to borrow gear. You could choose to go with a friend. You could choose to sleep in your car or a ground tent. It doesn't matter. The important thing is just to get started in any way you can. And I think that brings me to my second point, which is I would highly encourage everybody to borrow, rent, or build out slowly whatever your rig is going to be, or buy used to try stuff out. But your ideal setup is likely going to change over time. The more you do it, the more you learn, and the more you get a better sense of the type of camper you are and what sort of activities you want to do while you're out and about. And so buying something that's wholly finished outright is probably not the best solution for most folks. If you have a chance to, if you're really interested in a van and think that is going to solve all your problems, I encourage you to maybe rent a van for a weekend and just really get a sense going with it if that truly does meet the needs with the trade-offs that you're comfortable with, or whether it's borrowing a friend's rooftop tent or trailer. Similar. They all have their own trade-offs. They all come with great things about them, but also probably limitations in terms of the type of roads you're going to go on or types of adventures you're going to get up to, or maybe limits in terms of seasonality. And so building it out slowly and learning as you go is one of the best tips I can give anybody starting out in overlanding. The third tip is get creative problem solving. And this was brought home to me, like I mentioned, through all the classes that I went to at Overland Expo this past weekend, and really trying to get participants in the mind frame of not accepting an immediate failure as a stopping point, but thinking about whatever the solution was. If you're looking at first aid, it's thinking about what's the goal here? What are we trying to do? We're trying to stabilize this arm against the body. Okay. You don't have an actual medical splint. What other things could we use? Do we have rope? Do we have cam straps? Do we have hiking poles that we could even saw in half if we need to in order to make a splint? Just getting creative about the tools at your disposal and getting to exercise your sort of creative muscles in figuring out a solution to your problems, big or small, whether it's just for your own convenience or to safely get out of a situation. It's just such a good reminder that most of the time you've got way more tools, resources, and knowledge at your disposal to solve a problem than you probably think. And so pooling all of that together with whoever you're out with, or if you're out there alone, just being creative with what gear you've got along can go a long way towards solving problems and making you comfortable on the trip. The fourth takeaway I would say is invest in basics first. So don't worry about building out your dream rig if you don't have basic things like recovery gear, tire repair, water filtration system. And a lot of these things can be as simple as you want. So even traveling with a backpacking setup for water filtration, that could save your life in the backcountry. If you end up far away from a water source, but you've got a little packable water filter that you could put in a stream with some purification tablets, then you're good to go. And same with tire repair. It's having a couple of those basic things and know-how packed along for plugging a tire that gets some sidewall damage or has a puncture, that again could save your life. So just not forgetting the basics of the setup could actually be what makes the biggest difference in your adventures. And so making sure to invest in those first and foremost. And then my fifth and final tip is just a reminder to stop and smell the wildflowers. We are in what seems like the longest wildflower season I can never remember seeing in Washington. It was such a warm spring, and then usually we're really seeing the height of wildflower season in later July or even early August in some of the alpine regions. And I think we'll still get some of that, but because it was so warm here early on, it's been an amazing wildflower season, which is so many colors over so many weeks. And so when I think about just stopping to appreciate that, whether it's on my daily walk or whether it's on our drives to a campsite or trying to find a campsite, sometimes just stopping and getting out of the car, or stopping if you're going about your daily routine and just soaking in the beauty that's right in front of you, stopping to smell the flowers or notice a bumblebee or a hummingbird that's out in your garden. And just taking that little moment of reset can really make all the difference and really remind you why you're trying to be outside or why you're trying to do this adventure in the first place, and kind of remind you what it's all about. So just a reminder to take a little pause and stop and smell the wildflowers. Those are my big takeaways from both the season and Overland Expo. If you have anything that you are particularly excited to learn about, or follow-up questions from things I've mentioned, especially from what I learned at the Overland Expo, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to shoot me a comment or a direct message. And like I said, I'll be on a bit of a break here for at least the next month, but I'll let you guys know when I'm planning to be back with our second season. Thanks so much, guys, for tuning in. I've had such a fun time bringing you this whole season, starting from January with 22 episodes across months of travel and learning. It's been such a journey, and I'm really grateful that you've been a part of it. Thanks for listening.